Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our latest edition of the Risk and Regulation News channel of PwC. My name is Martin.neisen. I'm a partner with PwC here in Frankfurt, and I'm the SSM relationship partner. After several episodes where we went into the detail about ECB supervision, especially the SRB report from the beginning of this year, today we will speak about another very important topic in risk and regulation, and that is recovery and resolution planning. And of course, I'm doing that not alone. I have again a really expert on this topic here with me. It's Carole de Vergnies from our Brussels office. Hi, Carole. How are you?
Hi, Martin. I'm really good. Happy to be back.
Great. Carole, recovery and resolution planning is maybe a new topic for some of our viewers. So maybe you could give us a quick overview, like a general overview about what is recovery and resolution planning.
Of course. So you remember that around the years 2008, we had a little hiccups in the financial systems in Europe and worldwide. Well, one of the answers of the European supervisors were to create a system that would, on the one hand, restore the trust from the public into the financial system, but also build a financial system that would be more resilient. And if things were to go south and go bad at some point, that we would not use public money and taxpayers' money to restore viability of the banks. And that's what we have under the banking union. On the one hand, we have the single supervisory mechanism that tackles ongoing supervision of the banks. But also, we have the single resolution mechanism that actually makes bank resolvable, making sure that they are ready should a crisis happen. And recovery happens in going concern. It's part of the SSM. It's part of making plans when your situation deteriorates in order to restore the situation of the banks. But you're not reaching your point of viability yet. Whereas resolution happens in gone concern. Your viability is gone, there is no way to restore, and you need to be wind down in a manner that will not hurt the financial system, at least not hurt it too much.
Okay. So in general, there are two different kinds of banks that we have to observe. The banks that go simply into bankruptcy because they are not systematically important in general. For the bank itself, they are important, of course. And they are the banks that must be resolved when they get into trouble. How are these banks that need a resolvability plan, how are they identified?
Well, it actually starts from assessing what will be the impact on the financial system and will it hurt the stability of the financial system. So, for instance, some banks that are not systematically important banks are resolvable banks. You might have some less significant institutions that are deemed to be actually critical for the system and that bear what we call critical functions, meaning it's the functions that the banks provide to the economy as a whole. And so this is the first thing that the regulators, the SRB on the one hand, but also the national resolution authorities look at, is what are your functions towards the economy? What type of clients, enterprises do you serve? And what happens if these services are abruptly interrupted? And then the SRB will look into whether the banks can be wound up under normal insolvency proceedings. Does it make sense to keep it, to let it go with normal bankruptcy rules, or do we actually need to intervene in order to minimize the impact on the economy? And then, well, if we decide, not me or us, obviously, the resolution authorities, decide that the bank should be resolved, then they need to assess which strategy they would use. And they have a series of tools defined under a toolbox to actually resolve the banks, making sure that the losses are absorbed and that we can restore to a certain extent a viable entity that will be a very different one, but at least a healthy one from the banking crisis. And to do that, well, the authorities need to be reassured that the banks do have what it takes to be resolvable. What I mean by that is that a series of elements must be put in place and programs must be put in place within the banks, including having sufficient liquidity to absorb the shocks. But also having a sound governance, having a sound management information systems, communication plans, making sure that if things were to go bad, the banks have the right tools in order to be resolvable. And this is where we are at the moment. It's making sure that the banks are resolvable, making sure that they address what we call impediments, so obstacle to their resolvability. And then we set what we call the minimum requirements for eligible liabilities, which is a little buffer, well, not so little, that banks need to hold at all times in order to absorb the losses. And finally, well, in, let's say, ongoing concern, then the SRB will review the plans and make sure that the conditions for resolvability are kept at all times by the banks.
Okay. Carole, so it seems like that there's a lot of attention to these resolvability plans, and banks have to prepare for that. And it doesn't matter if we are speaking here about the smaller, less significant institutions or the significant institutions that are directly regulated and supervised by the SRB. But what are the expectations of the SRB and also the national regulators on the resolvability plans and the preparation for the banks?
Well, Martin, expectations is the right word, because a few years back, the SRB has published what they call expectations for banks, and they need to be fulfilled by the end of the year 2023. The new thing is that the EBA has now transposed them into guidelines. So it's no longer only the SRB banks that are concerned by those guidelines. And that is also why we see that a lot of resolution authority start to apply exactly the same requirements, albeit with the proportionality for smaller banks, but the same requirements, the same expectations as for larger banks, because the EBA has published these guidelines, and these guidelines are applicable as of 1st of January 2024, meaning that in 7 dimensions covering governance, loss absorbing capacity, liquidity and funding, operational continuity. So how do you get access to your critical services and financial market infrastructures? How can you continue to operate? Data, information systems, communication towards the outside world, and if finally what separability and restructuring, what your new entity, your resolved entity would look like after resolution. These are the 7 dimensions on which banks are now extremely busy working at the moment.
Okay. Carole, you mentioned the date of the 1st of January 2024, and my experience is whenever there is such a deadline, banks sometimes tend to the behavior that they wait too long until they actually start with taking actions, setting up the project. So what are actually the priorities of the banks in 2022? What should the banks do right now for being prepared for this date, the 1st of January 2024?
Well, Martin, the SRB has issued priorities to each of the banks, and they work with 3 priorities for all the banks that are liquidity and funding and resolution, making sure that the banks identify and are able to mobilize and monetize sufficient liquidities when it comes to resolution. They have sufficient absorption capacity going through their liabilities, but also collateral that they could mobilize. Also, the SRB now insists on separability and reorganization plans, so making sure that the banks has a view on what they will look like in the future. And the core of, let's say, this preparation at the moment is really making sure that the banks are able to see and have the sufficient data gathering capabilities, data assessment capabilities in order to be ready. These are the 3 dimensions that the SRB insists on for all the banks in their remit, under their remit today. But we see that the SRB on their end as well has also worked a lot on their own let's say, toolbox for being resolution authorities. And we see that they are working on going a bit deeper on, for instance, on-site inspections, on their own internal data analysis capabilities, etc. So banks need to really work now on making sure that the plans they have built in the previous year work. And that's what the SRB insists on, as operationalize the resolution planning.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carole. So it seems like that there are a lot of to-dos for the banks, actually, and they should not wait. And it's relevant for both the larger, significant institutions, but also the less significant institutions. And I think they have most of the work still in front of them. We, as PwC, we supported a lot of the larger SRB banks in setting up the recovery and resolution plans over the last years. So we have a lot of experience. So what are the key success factors? What are the recommendations of you to the banks, what they should do right now for being prepared?
Well, one of the biggest topic for this year is the bail-in dry run. So banks that face a bail-in strategy, and by bail-in it means that your liabilities must absorb the losses and be used and converted in order to rebuild equity. This is one of the most common strategies used by the SRB. Well, those banks need to perform a dry run. We go back to operationalize, try and test, see if it works. And that is the key that the SRB will be checking, is whether what you have built is actually viable and makes sense. And that goes into, do you have sufficient data? Can you produce your data set within the required time frame? Can you produce all of it? Do you have sufficient quality assurance on this? Does it make sense? But also, are your operational systems reliable? Can you work with that? This will be really the key learning points, I think, for the banks. And this exercise is really aiming at making banks aware of the shortcomings they might have in their plans. Because you might have the best textbook. If you don't test it, you don't know if it works.
Sure.
And I think what will be the key for the banks to perform this exercise with success is, on the one hand, making sure that they can test beforehand their bail-in data set, looking at where they can probably have some quick fixes if they don't have the entirety of the data, if they have gray zones. That will be important. Will be important also to really test what we call the operational sequence, the sequence of events. So if you enter a bail-in, who does what and when? This is extremely important because your people need to be prepared and need to have clear instructions. And lastly, well, it's going to be extremely important for banks to be prepared through developing an IT test environment, because obviously you will not run a bail-in in production, but also making sure that you anticipate as much as possible the hiccups along the road, because, I mean, a first exercise will also always bring hiccups. It's normal. It's in the course of things. But planning ahead and starting now allow you to actually understand better where you might be confronted with obstacles and improve before the exercise. And then the last element will be to have a right and professional team of observers that will draw a report, lessons learned, and integrate those lessons learned and findings into your working plan for next year, so that by the end of 23, you get much closer to being resolvable.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Carole. That was extremely insightful. You proved again that you are a real expert and that PwC has a lot of experience on recovery and resolution planning. Thanks again for being here today in Frankfurt. And thank you also very much for your attention. That's it for today already. If you have any further questions, if you want to benefit from all the experience that we gathered over the last years, do not hesitate to contact us. We have recovery and resolution experts in all Eurozone countries, so we can always connect you, and you only have to use the link in the description of this video. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Martin.
And bye-bye.
Bye.